The soft hum of conversation filled the first-class cabin of Flight 512. A gentle murmur of polite exchanges, rustling newspapers, and the occasional clink of a glass. Simone Caldwell settled into seat 2A, her fingers grazing the fine leather as she adjusted the buckle of her seatbelt. She was accustomed to luxury, she had earned it through long nights, gritted teeth, and a career that had taken everything from her before giving anything back. Outside, the tarmac stretched in long, gray veins, the bright sun casting sharp reflections on the windows of the airport terminal. A few passengers were still boarding, their heels clicking against the sleek floor of the jet bridge, their bodies carrying the effortless ease of privilege. Then, the atmosphere shifted. It was imperceptible at first, just a tensing of muscles, a tightening of lips. Eleanor Whitman turned her head slowly, as if something had invaded her carefully curated world. A woman of tradition, of expectations. She had stepped onto this plane expecting a sanctuary of familiarity. She did not expect Simone. Eleanor's gaze was practiced, a careful examination dressed as casual observation. She had been raised to notice things, to place people into categories before they had the chance to place themselves. And in her mind, first-class cabins had an unspoken order. A particular kind of traveler belonged here. And this wasn't one of them. Simone was used to this. She had seen it in boardrooms, in country clubs, in the way people hesitated before shaking her hand. But seeing it and feeling it were two different things. And she could feel it now, the unspoken judgment, the tightening of Eleanor's fingers around the armrest, the way her eyes flick. The flight attendant, Jessica, passed by, her professional smile steady, but Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Excuse me," she said, her voice light, but with a sharp undertone that cut through the air like a blade. She gestured toward Simone without looking at her. "I believe there's been a mistake." Jessica blinked. "A mistake, ma'am?" Eleanor's voice took on a measured patience, the kind reserved for explaining things to those who didn't understand the rules. "Yes, this woman," another flick of her hand toward Simone, like she was brushing away lint. "I don't believe she's in the right seat." Jessica hesitated, glancing at Simone, then back at Eleanor. "Miss Caldwell's ticket is confirmed for seat 2A. A beat of silence. Eleanor's face remained composed, but something flickered behind her eyes. A brief flicker of irritation, of disbelief. "Are you sure?" The question was casual, too casual. Simone turned her head slowly, locking eyes with Eleanor for the first time. "You seem concerned," she said, her voice even, measured. Eleanor inhaled sharply, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I simply don't like confusion when I fly." Jessica's posture stiffened. "There's no confusion, ma'am. Miss Caldwell is in the correct seat." Simone's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Looks like I belong here after all." The tension settled over them like a thick fog. The other passengers sensed it, the way people sense the coming of a storm. Some pretended not to notice, their eyes buried in newspapers or glowing screens. Others stole quick glances, waiting to see how this would unfold. Eleanor, unwilling to concede, gave a small, tight laugh. "I just think seating should be comfortable for everyone." Simone arched an eyebrow. "Oh? And what kind of seating would make you more comfortable?" Eleanor hesitated for the briefest moment, as though realizing that the battlefield she had chosen was more treacherous than she had expected. She could feel eyes on her now, assessing, waiting. Jessica cleared her throat. "Ma'am, if there's nothing else, I'd like to assist other passengers." The conversation should have ended there, but Eleanor wasn't ready to let it go. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. There had been an order to things, and it had just been disrupted in a way that made her chest tighten. As the final passengers settled, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady, low vibration, but Eleanor wasn't done. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and dialed. Simone heard it before she saw it, the shift in the air. The way Eleanor's voice took on a carefully measured urgency. The performance of it. "Yes, I need to report a security concern," Eleanor said, her voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Jessica turned sharply. "Ma'am, what are you doing?" Eleanor didn't acknowledge her. "Yes, I'm on flight 512. I'm sitting next to someone who is making me uncomfortable." Simone exhaled slowly, setting her book down on the tray table. "Here we go." Jessica's expression darkened. "Ma'am," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping but still carrying. "I don't know if she has the right ticket. And her bag, it looks heavy." I don't know what's in it. A hush fell over the cabin. Simone let out a short, humorless laugh. That's it. There was no need for direct words. No need to say what everyone understood. The accusation had been made. Not in words, but in implication. A businessman 2 rows ahead turned slightly, his lips pressing together in disapproval. A woman with a laptop looked up, shaking her head. The flight attendant's face drained of color. You can't just. Eleanor feigned confusion. I just think it's important to be cautious these days. Simone leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, but sharp enough to cut. Cautious of what, exactly? Eleanor hesitated for the first time. Just a flicker of uncertainty. Well, Simone tilted her head. Of me? Sitting here? Reading a book? The businessman across the aisle sighed heavily, setting his newspaper down. Are you seriously calling security because a black woman is sitting next to you? A murmur rippled through first class. Some exchanged glances. Others stared straight ahead, too familiar with this kind of scene to be shocked. Jessica's hands clenched. Ma'am, I need you to hang up the phone right now. Eleanor's expression twisted, caught between embarrassment and defiance. She opened her mouth, perhaps to deny, to defend, but before she could speak, the flight intercom crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, we've received a report from the cabin. Please remain seated as our security team addresses the situation. Simone closed her book with a soft snap and leaned back in her seat. Now, it was going to get interesting. At first, there was only silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that coils in the belly of a storm, waiting to explode. The flight continued its final boarding procedures. But the energy in first class had shifted. Passengers no longer settled in with casual ease. Their movements were slower, measured. Even those who had tried to pretend they weren't listening now held their breath, sensing that something had broken through the veneer of civility. Simone Caldwell sat still, not in defeat but in calculation. She had learned long ago that battles like these were not fought with raised voices or clenched fists. No, they were fought in the uncomfortable spaces between words, in the accusations left unsaid, in the silent complicity of the people who chose to watch rather than intervene. Eleanor Whitman, sitting just inches away, gripped her phone like a lifeline, her gaze darting around the cabin as if searching for an ally. And that was the difference between them. Eleanor had expected the world to bend to her discomfort. She had expected everyone to affirm her place in the hierarchy of things. But now, her kingdom wavered. Jessica, the flight attendant, was already moving swiftly, her professional calm straining at the edges. She reached out, lowering Eleanor's phone gently but firmly. Ma'am, she said, her voice hushed but resolute. I need you to end that call immediately. Eleanor hesitated. She had not planned for resistance. She had expected Jessica to respond the way the world always had, with silent, compliant obedience to her discomfort. I have a right to express my concerns, Eleanor said, her voice now sharper, defensive. Jessica exhaled, lowering herself slightly so that her voice didn't carry to the already eavesdropping passengers. Your concerns, she said carefully, are unfounded. Ms. Caldwell is in her assigned seat. There is no reason to escalate this. Eleanor's face twisted into something ugly. Escalate? She echoed, her tone laced with mock disbelief. I'm just looking out for everyone's safety. But I guess that doesn't matter to you. Jessica's jaw tightened. Simone, watching, felt a familiar sting, not from the words themselves, but from how they were delivered. The coded language, the shifting of blame, the insidious accusation that now hung over her head like a storm cloud. She was the one causing the problem. She had seen it before. Many times. When a woman like Eleanor could no longer justify her fear, she leaned on outrage instead. Simone glanced around the cabin. Some passengers refused to meet her eye. Others cast cautious glances, waiting to see how it would play out. The businessman across the aisle shook his head, muttering something under his breath. But he didn't intervene. A young red-haired woman with a tablet clutched it tighter, eyes flicking back and forth like she was debating whether to record the scene. But no one spoke. Not yet. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've received a security report from the cabin. We ask that all passengers remain seated while the matter is addressed. Simone felt the shift immediately, the tension escalating into something more tangible. Jessica turned on her heel and hurried toward the front of the cabin. no doubt to intercept whatever security detail was now being summoned. Eleanor's smirk returned. She smoothed out her blouse, sitting back like she had won, like she had restored order. Simone inhaled deeply, pressing her fingertips together. The worst part of this wasn't the humiliation, it was the predictability of it all. It was how calculated these moments were, how they played out with the precision of a script that had been rehearsed for generations. The moment she had sat in that seat, the ending had already been written. Minutes later, the curtain at the front of first class was pushed aside. 2 uniformed air marshals stepped in, their presence shifting the energy in the cabin from tense to electrified. Their navy blue uniforms bore the official emblem of authority. And in that moment, Simone knew that whatever logic or reason still existed in this situation was about to be swallowed whole by power. The lead marshal, a broad-shouldered man with a tired expression, glanced at Jessica, who stepped forward quickly. "We have a misunderstanding," Jessica started, but before she could explain, Eleanor spoke up. "She's the one," Eleanor said, her voice calm but dripping with conviction. "I don't feel safe sitting next to her." Simone tilted her head slightly, her stomach tightening. There it was, the accusation fully spoken aloud. The air marshal turned to Simone. "Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass?" Simone kept her movements slow, deliberate. She handed over her pass, watching as the marshal examined it. "She's in the right seat," Jessica interjected quickly. The marshal nodded, but instead of moving on, he turned back to Simone. "Would you be willing to move seats, just to de-escalate the situation?" Simone exhaled slowly. There it is. The burden was always hers to bear. She was expected to fix the problem, a problem she hadn't created. She could feel Eleanor's satisfaction radiating off her, as if she had successfully put the world back in its proper place. Jessica's face fell slightly, disappointment clear in her features. Simone studied the marshal, his eyes not unkind but full of expectation. He wasn't ordering her, not yet, but he was asking, and they both knew what that meant. "No," Simone said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm in my assigned seat." The air marshal's eyes flickered with something unreadable. He glanced at his partner, who remained silent. Eleanor scoffed. "Unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head. "Of course she's making this difficult." Simone clenched her jaw. And there it was again. That quiet, insidious accusation. She was being difficult, uncooperative, defiant. These were the words that could twist reality. That could shift blame. That could turn a woman sitting in her rightful place into a problem. The marshal sighed. "Look, ma'am, we're just trying to resolve the situation as smoothly as possible." Simone folded her arms. "You're asking the wrong person to solve it." A flicker of something uncertainty passed over the marshal's face. But before he could say anything else, a voice rang out. "This is ridiculous." It was the businessman across the aisle. Eleanor's head snapped toward him in shock. "She's sitting in her assigned seat," he continued, leaning forward. "And this woman," he gestured at Eleanor, "has done nothing but harass her since she sat down." The red-haired woman with the tablet nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "He's right. I've been watching the whole time." Other murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. Eleanor paled. The marshal straightened, his hesitation now turning into calculation. He glanced at Eleanor, then back at Simone. "Ma'am," he said, now looking at Eleanor, "you don't have any valid reason to request her removal. If you feel uncomfortable, you're welcome to switch seats." Eleanor's lips parted in shock, as though the rules of her world had just cracked apart. "But she stammered. Jessica turned to her, voice firmer now. "Would you like me to find you another seat in economy?" "Ma'am?" Eleanor inhaled sharply as though she had been slapped. Simone turned her head, meeting Eleanor's gaze. This time, she was the one watching her. And she smiled. For the first time, Eleanor had nowhere left to go. The storm had finally turned. The air in first class was thick, not with conversation, not with the smooth, idle luxury of a flight beginning its journey, but with something unseen. Something unspoken, yet undeniably present. It sat heavy on the chests of those who had dared to look, who had listened, who had felt the tide of this confrontation creeping up their spines, forcing them to make a decision. Would they keep their heads down and let the world turn as it always had? Or would they bear witness? Simone Caldwell had made her choice. She had drawn her line, and she would not be moved. She sat in seat 2A, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the closed cover of her book. She was calm, but it was the stillness of a storm held in check by sheer will. Eleanor Whitman, however, had not expected resistance, not from Simone, not from the passengers, and certainly not from the very authorities she had invoked. Her breath was shallow, her eyes darting around the cabin, seeking something, a lifeline, an ally, a system that had always justified her discomfort, validated her fears, enforced her place above others. But there was no justification this time. The lead air marshal, still standing in the aisle, had not yet holstered his authority. But the weight of the moment had shifted. For the first time, Eleanor was the one under scrutiny. And she knew it. The murmurs had started, a hushed current of voices washing through the first-class cabin. Some passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Others whispered behind hands and raised newspapers. Some reached for their phones, ready to document. Or perhaps, just to have proof that they were there when it happened. Jessica, the flight attendant, remained close, her fingers curled tightly around the notepad in her hand, her knuckles pale with tension. Then, Eleanor did what people do when the world does not bend to their will. She turned to rage. Her voice, when it came, was shrill, a note of desperation creeping beneath the polished edge of her usual composure. "So that's it?" she demanded, eyes flashing. "You're just going to let her sit there? I'm the one being disrespected. I'm the one feeling unsafe." She turned, her anger seeking a new target, landing on the businessman across the aisle, the one who had dared to speak up. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped at him. The man, his name was Harrison Lowe. A name that held weight in financial circles but meant little in the grander scheme of history, did not back down. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," he said coolly, adjusting his tie with a measured flick of his wrist. "And so does everyone else on this plane." Eleanor's jaw tightened. Her eyes darted to the red-haired woman 3 rows back. The one with the tablet. The one still recording. "This isn't fair," Eleanor spat. "You're all ganging up on me." Simone exhaled sharply through her nose. She knew this move, too. It was an old one. Shift the narrative. Become the victim. Cry injustice when justice comes knocking. Simone tilted her head slightly. Her voice smooth, controlled. "Tell me, Eleanor," she said, almost conversationally. "What exactly is unfair? That I sat down? That I didn't move when you wanted me to? Or is it that, for once, people are calling it what it is?" Eleanor flinched, visibly, as though she had been struck. Her mouth opened, but for a second, just a second, no words came out. She could feel the power slipping, the narrative she had carefully constructed beginning to fray at the edges. And then a lifeline. From behind the first-class curtain, another passenger emerged, a man in a charcoal gray suit. Polished, expensive, carrying the air of someone who never waited in lines or heard the word no. Simone recognized his type immediately. Wealth, privilege, entitlement worn so naturally it could be mistaken for confidence. His name was Lucas Whitman. And from the way Eleanor's face lit up with something dangerously close to relief, Simone knew this was her backup. Lucas swept his gaze across the cabin, taking in the situation with quick, calculated precision. He wasn't rushed, he had the patience of a man who believed time bent for him. His eyes flicked to Simone, to Jessica, to the air marshal still standing in the aisle. Then, he turned to Eleanor. "What's going on?" he asked smoothly, his voice oiled with feigned concern. Eleanor sucked in a breath, regaining some of her composure. This woman I called security because she was acting suspiciously. And now they're trying to make me move instead." Lucas's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A shift, a calculation, a decision. Simone saw it happen in real time. He turned to the air marshal, his smile polite, but his eyes sharp. "My wife was uncomfortable," he said. "I think we all want this to be a smooth flight. Maybe there's a way to de-escalate." Simone could hear the unspoken message. "Move her. Fix this. Restore order." The air marshal's expression flickered. His job wasn't to make moral judgments. His job was to keep the peace. To get the plane in the air without unnecessary conflict. And what was the easiest way to do that? Simone could see the answer forming in his mind. She knew what he was about to say. And she was tired. Tired of how easily this game was played. Tired of how often it ended the same way. So, before he could speak, she leaned forward, her voice cutting clean through the tension like glass against stone. "I'd like to hear you say it," she said. The marshal hesitated. Simone's eyes never left him. "Say it," she repeated, lower this time. Say that after everything, after proving I have a ticket. After sitting here quietly. After doing nothing, you're still asking me to move. Say it out loud so everyone can hear. The words settled like a weight in the cabin. A challenge. A dare. A demand for accountability. The marshal shifted on his feet. He glanced at Lucas. At Eleanor. And then at the passengers. At the businessman still watching. At the woman still recording. At the flight attendant who had not forgotten what was right. The weight tipped. Finally. He exhaled. Then turned to Eleanor. Ma'am, he said firmly. Your seat is in economy. You need to move. For the first time, Eleanor looked afraid. Lucas's jaw tightened. But he saw it, too. The battle was over. And they had lost. Jessica stepped forward. Would you like me to assist you, Mrs. Whitman? The plane was silent. All eyes were on Eleanor. She swallowed. And without another word, she grabbed her bag. With each step toward the economy cabin, the walls of her world shrank around her. And for the first time Simone could finally breathe. But she knew this war was not over yet. The moment Eleanor Whitman stepped beyond the first-class curtain, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted not to relief, but to something quieter, heavier, a reckoning. Simone Caldwell did not watch her go. She didn't need to. She could feel it, the slow, humiliating descent of a woman who had lived her entire life believing the world would arrange itself around her comfort. She could feel Eleanor's rage, the heat of it, the suffocating weight of her disbelief that, for once, she had not won. But Simone knew something else, too. It wasn't over. It never was. She picked up her book, flipped it open to the page she had been reading before this all began. But the words blurred, meaningless. Because what had happened, what always happened, was still echoing around her. Bouncing between the walls of the plane. Inside the minds of those who had witnessed it. The businessman across the aisle, Harrison Lowe, let out a low breath, shaking his head. Well, he muttered, that was a hell of a thing. The red-haired woman still clutched her tablet. The recording light now dimmed. But she was watching Simone now. Studying her the way people always did when they had just seen something ugly and didn't quite know where to put their discomfort. Jessica, the flight attendant, lingered near the front of the cabin, her shoulders still taut with the tension of what she had just helped unfold. And then there was Lucas Whitman, still standing in the aisle, still watching Simone. His presence alone was a weight, a threat not yet spoken. Lucas wasn't like Eleanor. No, men like him were different. Eleanor had reacted on instinct. The raw, unfiltered fear of a woman who had been conditioned to believe that her space was sacred. That certain people did not belong in her world. But Lucas had been taught strategy. Simone could see it in the way he adjusted his cuffs. In the way his expression had settled into something cool, unreadable. A calculation was happening. He had weighed the fight, measured the players, and determined the next move. Interesting, he finally said, his voice smooth, even. Simone didn't respond. You know, Ms. Caldwell, he continued, it really didn't have to be this way. She exhaled, finally looking up at him. And yet, here we are. Lucas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Just teeth. You made quite a spectacle out of my wife, he said. I imagine you must feel very proud of yourself. The words were careful, measured, but they dripped with danger. Simone met his gaze. Steady. Your wife made a spectacle out of herself. Lucas tilted his head, considering her. Then, after a pause, he let out a small, amused chuckle. A strong woman, he mused. You must think this is a victory. Simone closed her book. I don't think about it at all, she said, her voice controlled. Even, I paid for my seat. That's the end of it. Lucas's eyes darkened just a flicker. Just enough for Simone to know she had struck something deep. Because men like him, powerful men. Men who had never been told no. Men who had built entire lives around the assurance that they would always be in control hated nothing more than being ignored. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He smoothed a hand over his tie. Inhaled slowly, recalibrating. Then he leaned in, voice lower, intimate. You have no idea who you just humiliated, he said. Simone smiled. Finally, the mask was slipping. Humiliated? She said softly, tilting her head. I didn't make her call security. I didn't make her lie. I didn't make her assume I didn't belong here. Lucas's nostrils flared, just barely. That's not the point. It's exactly the point, Simone countered. A muscle in his cheek twitched. Simone leaned back. Walk away, Mr. Whitman. Your wife already lost this fight." Lucas didn't move. For the first time, the first-class passengers were fully watching him now, the same eyes that had ignored the initial injustice now locked onto his reaction to losing. And that was the only thing that could hold a man like Lucas Whitman in check. Not morality, not logic, but the shame of being watched. Finally, he exhaled, straightened, ran a hand down the front of his suit jacket, and smiled again, though it was a different smile now, the smile of a man who had lost a battle but had already begun planning a war. He adjusted his cufflinks. Then, in a voice just barely above a whisper, he said, "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Caldwell." And then he was gone, disappearing through the curtain, beyond the thin fabric that separated first class from the rest of the world. Simone should have felt relief. But instead, her fingers were tense against the cover of her book, because she had seen that look before. The look of a man who had decided that the rules did not apply to him. Who had built his entire life on the certainty that power was always within reach. Who had just realized for the first time that he had miscalculated. Lucas Whitman had left the cabin. But Simone knew he was not done. Not yet. The hum of conversation resumed. First class breathed again. Jessica approached, kneeling slightly beside Simone's seat. Her voice was low. "Careful. Are you all right?" Simone looked at her. She wanted to say yes. Wanted to let it be over. But it wasn't. Because people like Eleanor did not let go of their rage. Because people like Lucas did not forget their humiliation. Because power always finds a way to claw itself back. She inhaled deeply, nodded. "I'm fine." Jessica hesitated, searching her face for something unspoken. Then, quietly, she reached out just briefly and squeezed Simone's hand. Then she stood, straightened, and disappeared down the aisle. Simone turned back toward the window, her reflection faint in the curved glass. The plane had not yet taken off. But the war had already begun. For a moment, there was stillness. Not peace, no. Never that, but a temporary, uneasy quiet. The kind that stretches itself thin between battlefields. The plane had finally begun its taxi down the runway. The engines humming with the restrained power of something vast. Something unstoppable. The world beyond the window blurred as the aircraft gathered speed. Lifting away from the earth. From the weight of all that had happened. But the thing about altitude, about distance, is that it does not cleanse. Simone Caldwell knew this. The rules she had been forced to master. The delicate, dangerous balance of standing one's ground while appearing unthreatening, they did not vanish at 35,000 feet. She could still feel it. The residue of the conflict. The eyes still flickering toward her and then away. The question sitting heavily in the minds of those who had watched but not spoken. Had they done enough? Had they done anything at all? Jessica, the flight attendant, moved through the aisle now, offering tight smiles and hushed reassurances. Her professionalism a mask for the storm still lingering between them all. Simone was tired, not just from the incident, but from what always came after the processing. The cataloging of microaggressions, the mental fortification for the inevitable moment when power reasserted itself. Because it always did. Because Lucas Whitman was not a man accustomed to losing. And she knew deep in her marrow, in the part of her that had been forced to learn the language of survival, that he was not done. Not yet. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when Jessica reappeared at Simone's side, kneeling slightly beside her seat. Her voice was hushed, urgent. "Ms. Caldwell, I just wanted to let you know Mr. Whitman has been speaking with the captain." Simone inhaled sharply. Of course he has. She could picture it already. Lucas. His voice smooth, his tone one of patient, weary authority. He would frame himself not as the aggressor, but as the concerned, rational party. A man simply trying to ensure that order was restored. That, the right measures were taken. Simone turned her head slightly, locking eyes with Jessica. And? Jessica hesitated. "He claims he feels uncomfortable with the way things played out." Simone let out a breath of quiet laughter, shaking her head. "Uncomfortable?" Jessica nodded, eyes darting toward the front of the cabin. "I don't think he's trying to escalate. But I've worked flights with men like him before." A pause. "He's looking for an angle." Simone's fingers tightened around the armrest. "What did the captain say?" Jessica hesitated again, as if deciding whether to soften the truth or deliver it unfiltered. "He said he'd look into it." Simone's stomach twisted. This was exactly how it worked. Not with loud, open threats, but with quiet, insidious maneuvers. A conversation here, a private word there, a carefully crafted complaint. The power wasn't in the direct attack. The power was in the framing. The power was in who people were conditioned to believe. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "Jessica," she said, her voice even. "Are you telling me I might be removed from this flight?" Jessica's face darkened. "No, absolutely not. There's no policy reason to remove you. And frankly, I won't let that happen." Simone studied her for a moment. She believed her, but Jessica wasn't the captain. And the thing about power was that it didn't need a policy to function. It simply needed people who were afraid to challenge it. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The tension in Simone's chest did not ease. And then it happened. A voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received a report regarding a disturbance earlier in the flight. As a courtesy, I'd like to invite Ms. Caldwell to speak privately with our crew in the forward cabin." A silence fell over first class. The businessman across the aisle, Harrison Lowe, lowered his newspaper slightly, his brow furrowed. The red-haired woman who had been recording earlier shifted in her seat. Simone froze. This wasn't a request. It was a test. They were offering her the illusion of choice. If she refused, she would be labeled uncooperative. If she agreed, she would walk into a conversation designed to cast her as the problem. And the worst part? She had seen this play out before. A boardroom, a networking event, a dinner party where someone said something offensive. And when she didn't shrink herself, when she didn't let it slide, suddenly, she was the aggressive one. She had learned, painfully, that in these moments, the only way to win was to refuse to play the game. Jessica was already back at her side, whispering, "Simone, you don't have to go." But Simone could feel the pressure now. The weight of the waiting eyes. The hunger in Lucas Whitman's smirk as he watched her. His hand resting easily on the armrest of his seat. The game had been reset. And Simone had a choice to make. She inhaled, exhaled, then stood. Not hurriedly, not hesitantly, but with deliberate, unshaken control. A murmur passed through the cabin. Lucas's smirk twitched, like he had already won. Simone did not look at him. Instead, she turned to Jessica. "I'd like you to come with me." Jessica blinked, caught off guard. Simone met her gaze, held it steady. "If this is just a conversation, then I'd like a witness." Lucas's smirk faltered. Jessica hesitated, but then, she straightened. "Of course," she said. Simone turned, walked. Each step toward the forward cabin was measured, purposeful. Behind her, the eyes of the passengers burned into her back. She stepped through the curtain, and the door closed behind her. The trap had been set. But Simone Caldwell had seen the game for what it was. And this time she wasn't playing. There was a peculiar stillness in the forward cabin. It was the kind of silence that had weight. That stretched and thickened the air. That made you acutely aware of every breath, every movement. Simone Caldwell stood just beyond the threshold, the curtain sealing her off from the rest of first class. The murmurs of passengers had faded behind her, replaced by the cold, sterile hush of authority. The captain was waiting. The co-pilot stood just behind him, arms crossed, face unreadable. A senior flight attendant, a man Simone hadn't seen before, hovered nearby, clipboard in hand. And then, of course, there was Lucas Whitman, seated at the edge of the small space. His suit pristine, his face composed, but his eyes were alight with something smug, something victorious. This was his domain now. She could feel it in the arrangement of bodies, in the careful positioning of power. Lucas sitting, Simone standing, the captain at ease, the flight crew watching but not intervening, the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. Jessica, who had insisted on accompanying her, shifted uneasily beside her, her presence a small but significant crack in whatever Lucas had planned. Simone inhaled slowly. She had been here before. Not here, not on a plane, but here in the ritual of intimidation. The slow unraveling of dignity disguised as a conversation. And she knew this wasn't a conversation at all. The captain spoke first. His voice was measured, patient, too patient. "Ms. Caldwell," he said, hands resting lightly in front of him. "We appreciate your cooperation." Simone didn't respond. She let the words settle. Let them hang in the air just long enough for him to realize that she wasn't here to make this easy. The captain cleared his throat. There have been some concerns raised regarding the situation earlier. Simone tilted her head slightly. Concerns? The captain nodded, glancing toward Lucas, who sat back, perfectly comfortable, perfectly in control. Yes, Mr. Whitman here has expressed that he and his wife feel, he chose his words carefully, distressed about the altercation. Simone felt something low and sharp curl in her chest. Jessica's breath caught beside her. Barely audible, but there. Lucas hadn't been the one humiliated. Lucas hadn't been the one forced to justify his presence. But here he was, the victim. Simone had seen this play before hell. She had memorized the script. She was no longer the person wronged. No longer the woman who had been targeted for simply existing in the wrong seat. Now, she was the disturbance, the escalation, the incooperative force that needed to be handled. The framing was happening in real time. Rearrange the truth just enough. Shift the weight of blame ever so slightly until reality no longer resembled itself. Simone exhaled through her nose. Controlled, steady. What exactly? She asked. Is there complaint? Lucas smiled. They feel unsafe, the captain said. They feel that the situation got out of control and that your presence in first class has created tension for them. Simone almost laughed. The audacity of it. Jessica's voice cut through. Tight, restrained. With all due respect, Captain, that is not what happened. The captain looked at her, blinking as if just remembering she was there. Jessica pressed on. I was present for the entire exchange. Ms. Caldwell was sitting in her seat when Mrs. Whitman called security on her. She did nothing to provoke the situation. Lucas's smirk twitched, just slightly. But the captain did not acknowledge Jessica's words. He simply nodded, slow and diplomatic. I understand this has been a stressful situation for everyone. There it was again. That evening out of the conflict. That smoothing down of edges. The distortion of truth into something palatable. Something that would allow everyone in this room except Simone to walk away feeling unscathed. We'd like to find a way to move forward without further tension. The captain continued. I understand you have a valid first-class ticket. Ms. Caldwell, we're not asking you to move. Simone studied him. Not yet. They weren't. But, the captain went on, we do have an open seat in business class. If you'd be willing to switch, I think it would help de-escalate the situation. Jessica stiffened. De-escalate what? The problem is gone. Lucas's gaze flickered toward Jessica, and for the first time, something sharp passed through it. A calculation. A warning. Simone saw it, too. Lucas wasn't just playing for the seat anymore. He was playing for control of the entire story. Simone turned back to the captain. Voice measured. So let me get this straight, she said, folding her arms. A woman harasses me, calls security on me, gets removed for violating airline policy, and now I'm the one being asked to move? The captain shifted, his shoulders tightening. We're not asking you to move, Ms. Caldwell. You're simply offering me an option I never asked for, Simone said smoothly. And why? Because one man, she gestured toward Lucas, wants to rewrite what happened. The captain exhaled, frustration creeping in. Good. I'd like to get this flight to Los Angeles with as little conflict as possible, he said. Simone gave him a slow, knowing smile. I bet you would. She let the words land. Let them sink into him. Because that was the real problem, wasn't it? It wasn't about justice. It wasn't about truth. It was about what made things easier. And right now, she was the inconvenience. Lucas's voice broke the silence. Oiled and easy. If Ms. Caldwell is so intent on staying in first class, that's her choice. It was a trap. If she stayed, she was the difficult one. The woman who refused the perfectly reasonable offer. If she left, she accepted the lie that she was the problem all along. Simone had seen this before. She had been taught, as all black women are taught, to be mindful of the cost of taking up space. She had seen colleagues maneuver around it. Had watched women shrink themselves to avoid the consequences of being labeled too much. She had done it herself. More times than she could count. But not today. Not here. Simone took a breath, let it settle, then turned to the captain. I'll be staying in my assigned seat, she said. Lucas smiled, but this time, it was tight, forced. Simone met his gaze, unblinking, unmoved. Game over. The captain hesitated just for a fraction of a second, then exhaled. Understood. And just like that, it was done. Jessica let out a breath beside her. Almost disbelieving, Lucas remained seated, his fingers pressing just a little too hard into the armrest. The captain adjusted his cuffs, nodded, and turned. "Let's get back to the flight." Simone smiled. She had won, but she knew Lucas Whitman was not the kind of man who forgot a loss. And something told her this would not be the last time their paths would cross. The hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin, but the air was anything but still. There was no real silence, only the quiet before a storm. A pregnant pause between unfinished sentences. Simone Caldwell remained in her seat, upright, composed, the picture of restraint, but beneath the calm, her pulse was a steady drum against her ribs. A rhythm she knew well. A rhythm she had learned to live with. She had won, or so it seemed. Lucas Whitman sat just a few rows ahead. His body relaxed, but his fingers tapped slow, deliberate, calculating against the polished wood of his tray table. It was a silent message, a promise whispered through the language of men who never heard the word no. Simone had seen that look before. Men like Lucas never lost, they simply recalculated. Jessica, the flight attendant who had fought alongside her in the subtle way that only those who understood injustice could, passed by once, offering a small, tight smile, a silent question. "Are you okay?" Simone nodded, just barely, and turned toward the window. The sky stretched beyond the glass, vast and unbroken, a reminder that even up here above cities and highways and the boundaries of men power still found a way to enforce itself. She was waiting now, waiting for whatever came next. And it came. The first sign was small. An announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received a request from our flight crew to keep the aisles clear as we begin beverage service." It was phrased as a simple procedural reminder. But Simone knew. Her movements had been restricted. There was no reason to say it. No one else had been moving, but the captain had issued an order. And it was one Simone had learned to recognize. Sit still. Don't cause trouble. Don't give us a reason. Lucas had found a way to tighten the leash. Simone felt the shift in the air as the crew moved more cautiously now. As though expecting something to erupt. As though she was the disturbance they were preemptively preparing for. She knew how it would play out if she protested. She could already hear the words forming in their minds. The gentle yet firm insistence that it was, for everyone's comfort. It was always comfort that was used against people like her. It was never her comfort, of course. That was irrelevant. It was the comfort of those who had the luxury of never being challenged. Of never feeling out of place. Of never being made to shrink. Simone pressed her lips together and waited. The next move would come. It always did. An hour passed. Then two. The flight stretched across the sky. But inside, something coiled tighter. Then a shadow. A flight attendant. One Simone had not interacted with before. A man with an easy smile but careful eyes. Stopped at her row. "Miss Caldwell," he said, "the captain would like to have a word with you in the galley." Simone's fingers stilled against the fabric of her pants. Another test. She could refuse. She had every right to. But she knew the consequences of winning too many battles in a row. She stood, slow, measured, as if she were stepping onto a stage for a performance she had not auditioned for but had been forced to learn by heart. Jessica was nowhere in sight. Lucas, however, was watching. The air in the galley was cooler. The walls pressing in, the hum of the engines louder here. Like static. The captain was waiting, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. A man trying to decide if he wanted to be the enforcer or the peacemaker. "Miss Caldwell," he started, his voice even, diplomatic. "I wanted to personally check in." Simone did not reply. She knew better than to fill the silences men like this created. He cleared his throat. "It's important to me that all passengers feel safe and comfortable on this flight." There it was again. Comfort. Safety. Words that were only weapons when aimed at the wrong people. She tilted her head slightly. "Am I making someone unsafe, Captain?" The man hesitated. "No, of course not. This is just a sensitive situation." Simone's lips twitched. Lucas had escalated. She didn't know how. Maybe a quiet word to the right person. Maybe an official-sounding complaint full of vague concern, but he had found a way to make her presence an issue again. And the captain, a man who only wanted his flight to be uneventful, had taken the bait. "What exactly?" Simone said, her voice smooth as silk stretched over steel. "Is the situation?" The captain exhaled, glancing toward the curtain that separated them from first class. Mr. Whitman has suggested that he and his wife no longer feel safe." Simone almost laughed. Instead, she turned her gaze onto him. Let it sit. Let him feel the weight of it. She waited. The silence stretched long enough for him to feel it now, the absurdity of his own words. The quiet but sharp realization that he was being used. She leaned forward just slightly. "I see," she said. "And what do you suggest?" Because that was the game now. The captain shifted his weight. He had no real solution. And that was her advantage. He could not remove her. He had no grounds. He could not demand anything of her. She had done nothing wrong. But the pressure was there. The expectation that she would take the burden. That she would make his life easier. She had seen men like him before, good men. Even decent men, who simply wanted to avoid confrontation. And she had seen how dangerous that desire could be. Finally, after a long pause, the captain sighed. "Let's just try to get through the rest of this flight peacefully." Simone smiled then, not because she was relieved, but because she had won again. And that meant Lucas Whitman was running out of moves. Back in her seat, Simone exhaled slowly, watching as the world beyond the window stretched endlessly. Unbroken, Jessica reappeared moments later, eyes scanning her face, searching. "He tried again, didn't he?" Simone nodded once. Jessica clenched her jaw. "Bastard." Simone let out a quiet chuckle. "He's persistent." Jessica's voice dropped. "I should have been there." "You were," Simone said softly. "You still are." Jessica hesitated then. Without another word, she reached down and refilled Simone's wineglass. An offering, a refusal to let her sit in this alone. Simone took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle. Lucas had played every card he had. And he had lost. But Simone knew something else. Men like Lucas Whitman didn't just lose. They remembered. And they waited. And sometimes, the real battle didn't end in the sky. Sometimes, it began once you landed. The plane continued forward. And below them, the city of Los Angeles stretched toward the horizon. Waiting. The plane began its slow descent into Los Angeles. The city lights flickering below. Sprawling and endless. A maze of opportunity and quiet battles waiting to be fought. The engines roared with a familiar power. A reminder that even after all that had transpired in the sky, gravity always won in the end. Simone Caldwell remained still, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. Her breathing steady. She had won. But victory, as always, was not without its price. Lucas Whitman had not looked at her since she returned to her seat. That, more than anything, told her exactly what was coming next. Men like him did not forget. They did not surrender. Nor did they accept the reality of a world that refused to yield to them. They simply waited for a new moment. A new battlefield. A new way to rewrite the past. Jessica, the flight attendant who had stood beside her in ways that would never be recorded, lingered near the front of the cabin. Her eyes sharp, scanning for the unseen. Simone knew what she was searching for. The next move. The retaliation. Because there was always a next move. And it came the moment the plane touched down. The moment the seatbelt light blinked off. The energy in the cabin shifted again. First-class passengers began reaching for their bags, adjusting their collars, checking their reflections in their darkened screens. It was an orchestrated ballet of people accustomed to moving first. Always first, without pause, without interruption. But Simone did not move. She waited, because something told her she was not finished yet. Lucas stood, slowly, rolling his shoulders, smoothing down the crisp lapels of his suit jacket. He adjusted his cuffs, clearing his throat just slightly, a signal, a preparation. And then, just as she expected, he turned. Not to her. Not directly. No, he turned to a flight attendant, the male one who had led her to the galley. The one who had been careful, cautious, but ultimately aligned himself with power. "I'd like to speak to airport security," Lucas said. His voice was polite, but politeness was the sharpest blade men like him wielded. Simone inhaled, slow and deep. Here it was, the final move. The flight attendant hesitated, but only briefly. Then he nodded, because what else was he supposed to do? Jessica's head snapped toward Lucas, her jaw tightening. "Mr. Whitman." Lucas raised a hand, dismissing her without so much as a glance. "It's a security matter. I'm sure you understand." Jessica opened her mouth then closed it. Her fight was not over. But it had reached its limit. Simone stood then. Smoothly, deliberately. She picked up her bag. adjusted the strap across her shoulder. Lucas turned just slightly, just enough to meet her gaze for the first time since their last battle. And he smiled. A quiet, victorious thing. Simone felt a slow burn crawl up her spine. Not fear, not quite, but something else, something that whispered, "They will never stop." The air in the jet bridge was thick, humid in the way only airport air could be, clogged with the scent of jet fuel, of sweat, of impatience. Passengers moved quickly, eager to disappear into the city, into their waiting cars, into their lives untouched by what had unfolded above the clouds. But not Simone, not Lucas, not the two uniformed security officers standing just beyond the exit gate. Their expressions unreadable, their stance wide, prepared, braced for conflict. Jessica cursed under her breath beside her. "This is bullshit." Simone exhaled, steady. She had seen this too. Had felt this moment before on sidewalks, in department stores, in corporate boardrooms where she had spoken too directly, taken up too much space. The manufactured escalation, the attempt to take back power through institutional force. Lucas knew what he was doing. He wasn't going to get her dragged off the plane. That would be too obvious. Too crude. No, he would force her to answer for nothing. To stand under the glow of fluorescent lights while two men in uniform asked her to explain herself. To justify why she had the audacity to exist where she had been told she did not belong. She stepped forward before they could call her name. One of the officers, a man with graying hair and a sharp gaze, nodded toward her. "Ms. Caldwell?" "Yes. We just need to have a quick word." Of course they did. She nodded, following them just a few steps away from the gate. Not into a room, not yet. That would be too much. Too fast. They had to make this look normal. The first officer cleared his throat. "We received a report of a disturbance on the flight." Simone let her lips curl slightly. A disturbance? From whom? The officer hesitated. "I'm not at liberty to say." Simone tilted her head. "Was it Lucas Whitman?" The younger officer, a black man whose shoulders seemed tight beneath his uniform, blinked sharply. The older officer ignored the question entirely. "Can you explain what happened between you and the Whitmans?" Simone knew the game. This wasn't about finding the truth. This was about recording her response. About forcing her to react in a way they could use. About making her appear defensive, agitated, unreasonable. She would not play. She folded her arms, exhaling slowly. "Am I being detained?" The younger officer shifted on his feet. "No, ma'am, we just need. Then I'd like to go," Simone said smoothly. A pause. A calculation. The older officer nodded once. Slow. Assessing. "You're free to go, Ms. Caldwell." Simone turned. Jessica was waiting, the only familiar face in a sea of those who had chosen not to see. Lucas was waiting too, but she did not give him the satisfaction of looking at him. She walked. Past security. Past the whispers. Past the shadows of a fight she had won, but would always have to fight again. And when she stepped through the automatic doors and into the night, the city stretched before her. Glittering. Electric. Alive. Waiting. For the next battle. For the next reckoning. For the world to decide if it was ready for a woman like her. Simone inhaled the cool Los Angeles air. And walked forward.